Throughout history, there have been many rich and successful individuals who had fortunate lives. Yet, there are also cases of wealthy individuals who are stalked by tragedy, from family curses to disappearing without a trace. In this video, we will explore all of this and more. For our first tale, we are going to New York, where one heiress vanished without a trace, which was narrated by the brilliant Briefcase.
Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold was born in New York City on the 1st of July 1885. Her father was Francis Rose Arnold, a businessman whose family traced its ancestry back to the beginning of European colonization in North America, with one forebear having allegedly arrived at Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower in 1620. His more immediate ancestors had become embedded in New York high society and business, with Francis himself being a partner in F.R. Arnold & Co., an import company which brought luxury goods into America from abroad. This was an era of unprecedented prosperity in the United States, the so-called Gilded Age, and so the Arnold business, which specialized in perfume, flourished, meaning that Dorothy grew up wealthy and in a family which was known around Manhattan. Dorothy's mother was Mary Martha Arnold. Her maiden name was Samuel, and she hailed from a prominent family whose origins lay in British Canada. She and Francis had 3 other children, a son, John, who was older than Dorothy, and another son and daughter, Dan and Marjorie, born in the years after Dorothy. To further add to the family's social status, Dorothy's aunt on her father's side, Harriet, was married to Rufus W. Peckham, a noted lawyer who served as an Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court between 1895 and 1909. All of these connections would ensure that when Dorothy suddenly disappeared many years later, the story attracted significant media attention both in New York and across the country. Dorothy's childhood was along the lines that one would expect of a daughter of a rich businessman in New York. At the height of the Gilded Age, the family lived in a large townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and had a considerable staff there. Growing up, she attended the elite Veltin School for Girls. This had been founded in 1886 by Louise Velton as a school in Manhattan for the daughters of the city's wealthier families, with what was, by the standards of the time, a very progressive curriculum for a female school. Here the girls learned subjects such as English literature, Greek and Roman classics and French, but she also studied the science subjects like chemistry and physics. After her time in Velton, Dorothy headed for Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, leaving New York for the first extended period of time in her life. There she focused on studying literature and developed aspirations to become a writer. She graduated in 1905 when she was 20 years old. Following her graduation, she again lived in her parents' house on the Upper East Side and was often seen at high society events in Manhattan. Yet she retained some ambitions as a writer. After a trip to the family vacation home in the state of Maine in the autumn of 1910, she informed her father that she wanted to get her own apartment in Greenwich Village. This was an area that had already begun to acquire a reputation as a centre of bohemianism and literary activity. In the course of 1909 and 1910, she had also composed several stories with titles like Poinsettia Flames and Lotus Leaves. Yet sadly for Dorothy, her stories had been constantly rejected by the publishers to whom she had sent them. What was worse, her family mocked her literary ambitions, and her father had refused to fund her desire to live in Greenwich Village, informing her that she could just as easily write in the family home as down in Lower Manhattan. These personal setbacks are important for her later story, as we will soon see. On a cold morning on the 12th of December 1910, Dorothy decided to travel downtown from the Arnold family home. Her mother had suggested travelling out with her, but Dorothy told her not to and informed her that she was just going down to Fifth Avenue to get an evening dress for a party, which was being held for her younger sister Marjorie in a few days' time. Dorothy was also heading to Brentano's bookstore to pick up some books. On the day in question, she was observed to have been well dressed in an expensive coat of blue serge with fur and a satin bag. These are important points to note, as her expensive clothes would have made her stand out on Manhattan's busy streets and could have made her a target for theft. She was also wearing a very noticeable black velvet hat with 2 blue roses on it. Down on Fifth Avenue and some streets off it, she purchased a number of things, including a box of candy, in a store where the salesgirl recognised her well enough to charge the sale to the family account without even asking her who she was. Outside Brentano's bookshop, Dorothy ran into Gladys King, an acquaintance of the family who was attending Marjorie's party in a few days' time. She handed Dorothy the acceptance notes that she had been intending to post to say that she would attend the party, and noted that it would save on postage. This was at around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Dorothy mentioned to Gladys that she was about to head back home to the Upper East Side and would probably do so by walking through Central Park. With that, they departed from one another. Gladys King would be the last person to ever speak with Dorothy Arnold that we know. After she said goodbye to Gladys, Dorothy was not seen again by anyone who knew her. She failed to show up for dinner at her family home, and her parents and siblings were immediately concerned. It was not like Dorothy to miss dinner, and if she was running late or had decided to go somewhere, she would always send word ahead to excuse her absence. The Arnold family did not immediately contact the authorities. This was understandable. Few people ring the police straight away when a person goes missing, when it's only for a few hours, and yet they were clearly worried. That evening, phone calls were discreetly made to some of Dorothy's friends to inquire if they had seen her or if she was possibly out visiting them that day. All responded that they hadn't. The Arnolds were anxious at this moment to not let word get out that their daughter had seemingly ran away. This created a situation which led to problems in the weeks that followed. On the night of her disappearance, one of Dorothy's friends that the family had called earlier that evening, named Elsie Henry, had rang the Arnold house at about midnight to see if Dorothy had returned. In response, Dorothy's mother, a woman of a nervous disposition at the best of times, responded that Dorothy had returned home but couldn't speak to Elsie, as she had immediately gone to bed with a headache. This incident led to suspicions in the weeks ahead that the Arnolds knew more about Dorothy's disappearance than they were admitting, though it doesn't appear that this was the case. It got worse in the days that followed. Fearing a media frenzy, given their prominence in New York society, the Arnolds decided not to report Dorothy's disappearance. Instead, they continued to make discreet inquiries to try and determine where she might be, as well as hiring a family friend and lawyer named John Keith to undertake some investigations for them. It seems that at this early juncture, the family believed that Dorothy had absconded in retaliation for their lack of support for her literary ambitions. It was only after agents from the Pinkerton Detective Agency were hired and failed to come up with any leads as to where Dorothy might be that they and Keith convinced Dorothy's parents in mid-January, weeks after Dorothy's initial disappearance, to go to the city police and file a formal missing persons report. A press conference was held in Frances Arnold's office in Manhattan on the 25th of January 1911 to announce the disappearance of his daughter over 6 weeks after she had gone missing. He offered a $1,000 reward for any information which aided in locating her, a sizable sum equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. The predicted media frenzy followed, much of it focused on a clandestine relationship which Dorothy had been engaged in for some time prior to her disappearance with George Griscom Jr., the son of a wealthy Pennsylvania businessman. Griscom and Dorothy had got to know each other while she had been studying at Bryn Mawr and had remained in frequent contact since. However, he was holidaying in Italy at the time Dorothy disappeared and stated that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigations. One line of inquiry was whether she had been attacked in Central Park while walking through there, as she had told Gladys King she had intended to do when she met her on Fifth Avenue. Dorothy's father himself seemed to think that this was the most likely explanation and morbidly speculated that his daughter had been killed there and her body had been thrown into the reservoir in the park. Yet police soon dismissed this theory. They noted that the water level of the reservoir in mid-December 1910, when Dorothy had disappeared, had been too low to conceal her body if she had died in that way. The mystery deepened when in early February the Arnolds received a postcard that simply said, "I am safe," and which was signed Dorothy. The handwriting mirrored their daughter's, but a sample of her handwriting had been featured in the New York newspapers as part of the investigation in late January, and it was soon concluded that the postcard was just a cruel joke that had been perpetrated by someone mimicking Dorothy's handwriting. Having dismissed this, the police announced towards the end of February that the investigation was being scaled down. Dorothy had been missing for 75 days at the point they made the announcement, and without any evidence of any kind to suggest what might have happened to her, they could only conclude that she was almost certainly dead. There were numerous supposed sightings and reports of contact with Dorothy in the years that followed. These were often based on speculative claims that a woman resembling her had been seen in New York or somewhere else on the East Coast, but nothing concrete ever came of these alleged sightings. But they continued to arise. As late as 1935, a quarter of a century after Dorothy disappeared, a tip was given to police about a sighting of her on Fifth Avenue, the last place that she had been seen, on the 12th of December 1910. This in itself indicates the manner in which people let their imaginations run away with them when it came to sightings of Dorothy Arnold. After all, she would have been 50 years of age by then, and probably looked unrecognisable from the 25-year-old woman who had disappeared back in 1910. Meanwhile, Dorothy's parents continued to search for her, and before her father died in 1922, he had spent upwards of $250,000 in an effort to find his daughter or discover what had happened to her. There are three major theories concerning Dorothy's disappearance today. One is very speculative. It holds that Dorothy was pregnant at the time, most likely with George Griscom's child, and had undergone a makeshift termination that evening, which went wrong, and during which she died. This seemed to be corroborated in 1916, when a convicted felon in Rhode Island, named Edward Glenaris, made sensational claims about how he had been involved in disposing of the young lady's body back in December 1910, but the information he provided about where she was buried was not confirmed on further investigation, and he later retracted his claim. Furthermore, it is highly improbable that Dorothy would have simply planned to stop off somewhere in Manhattan on her way home from Fifth Avenue to have a quick back alley termination before continuing on with her day. The other two scenarios are more likely. Either Dorothy was attacked in Central Park, killed, and her body disposed of in such a way that left no trace, or else, disappointed at her personal circumstances and her stalling literary ambitions, she took her own life. Some of her family members favoured this explanation of her disappearance, as in a letter she wrote to George Griscom, she alluded to suicide, stating, "Well, the short story has come back. McClure's has turned me down. Failure stares me in the face. All I can see ahead is a long road with no turning. Mother will always think an accident has happened." Furthermore, at this point, her relationship with Griscom was going downhill. Both seemed plausible, but with no evidence to substantiate either eventuality, it seems we will never know for sure what happened to the American socialite who disappeared without a trace.
Next, we are going to the early 19th century, where Mortis Media is waiting to tell us about the world's greatest miser, who was ironically also one of the world's richest women.
Henrietta Howland Robinson was born on the 21st of November 1834 in the town of New Bedford in Massachusetts to parents Edward Mott Robinson and Abby Howland. She came from a very affluent background, and her family ran the largest whaling fleet in the area, while also being involved in US trade with China at a time when American trade with the Asian nation was heavily protected and only a limited number of people were allowed to engage in it. Surrounded by business people throughout her youth, she was soon involved in it herself. As a child, she began reading stock reports and financial papers, and by the time she was 13, she was working as a bookkeeper for the family business. From a young age, frugality and the interest in making money was drilled into her. On one occasion, Henrietta said to a reporter, "My father told me never to give anyone anything, not even kindness." Henrietta, who acquired the abbreviated name Hetty quite young, did not earn her first fortune. When her mother died in 1860, Hetty was just 25. She left most of her estate to her husband, but Henrietta received a house, which was worth upwards of $250,000 in today's money. Thereafter, her father diversified the family business, investing in New York shipping companies and buying government bonds which paid the incredibly lucrative rate of 6% interest annually. The country had just come through the American Civil War, and there was a lot of money to be made in rebuilding the economy. Hetty's father did very well at the time. When he died 5 years after his wife in 1865, he left $6 million to Hetty, a sum equivalent in excess of $100 million today. Right around the same time, her aunt also passed away, leaving a comfortable $2 million estate to her niece. Although the estates involved became the subject of protracted legal battles in the few years immediately after, she also received hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and this money combined made Hetty a very wealthy woman. Her determination to steer her own path when it came to managing her finances was seen in her marriage arrangement. In the early 1860s, she had met and began a relationship with Edward Henry Green, a Boston-based businessman whose financial dealings also involved working in the China trade. He was a millionaire himself, so when he and Hetty got married in 1867, she insisted that an arrangement was put in place whereby he would have no claim to her money and estate. They subsequently had 2 children, Edward, born in 1868, and Harriet, known as Sylvia, born in 1871. Both were born in London, where the couple had relocated for some years in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Hetty and Edward would eventually separate in the mid-1880s, though they remained married and in their later life partially reconciled. The cause of their falling out was owing to Edward running into financial problems after they returned to the United States in 1873. Well, on several occasions she had to bail him out by giving him money. But by that time, she had more than enough to go around, for Hetty Green had become one of the preeminent investors of the rapidly increasing financial capital of America during the Gilded Age, Wall Street on Manhattan Island in New York. Hetty emerged into the American business world during the so-called Gilded Age. This was the first age of globalization, as the proliferation of the railways, electricity, the telegraph, and the telephone opened up vast parts of the world. As this occurred, coupled with major industrial expansion in countries such as the United States, Britain, Germany, and Russia, a huge economic boom occurred in North America and Europe. The resulting wealth creation and the emergence of a new aristocracy of rich business people and industrialists had led the period between 1870 and the 1900s being referred to as the Gilded Age in America. Though it should be noted that for the poorer classes in society, this was a period of grinding poverty and appalling working conditions. The Gilded Age in America saw the emergence of Wall Street as the financial center of New York, and the wider country. This street, the name of which is derived from the fact that the northern wall of New York City ran along this region in the late 17th century, had started to become the financial capital of the US in the early 19th century, once the Erie Canal was completed in 1821. The canal linked the Great Lakes to New York City, and as a result, Chicago and other settlements along the lakes ballooned in size in the middle of the 19th century. New York now became the entry point for all naval traffic between the Atlantic and the booming development of the Great Lake region. And so, financial interests began buying up property all over Wall Street, and it soon became the financial hub of the East Coast. In the course of the 1860s and 1870s, high influential companies and business people such as J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, the American Tobacco Company, General Electric, and Charles Dow, among others, established business interests here. Consequently, Wall Street entered into a period where mere mentions of its name became synonymous with talk of American financing and business. This was epitomized in 1889 when the Wall Street Journal went into circulation as the paper on record on stock reports and finance. This was the Wall Street that Hetty Green began making her presence felt in during the last quarter of the 19th century. Even when the Greens had been living in London, Hetty had begun investing in American bonds traded on Wall Street. She originally invested the interest which accumulated from the estate her father had left her as she plowed this money into railroad bonds at the time when the country was being rapidly connected by railway lines. She also purchased an extensive amount of greenbacks. This was emergency money, which the Union government had printed in large quantities between 1861 and 1865. To pay for the huge spending necessitated by the Civil War with the Southern Confederacy. These greenback dollars had depreciated in value in years that followed, but Hetty continued to hold them in large quantities. She was handsomely rewarded in 1875, when, in response to a crisis surrounding the notes, the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant backed the greenbacks with gold. The value of the notes increased hugely, and Hetty made a considerable profit. This was all part of her wider investing philosophy, which was to buy when things are low and nobody wants them, and keep them until they go up and people go crazy to obtain them. As the years went by, her wealth continued to increase into the tens of millions, and she eventually became a major provider of loans to the municipal government of New York City as the Gilded Age came to an end, and some serious economic problems overwhelmed the American economy in both the 1890s and 1900s. At one point, it was believed that she was the largest individual private lender of money in all of New York, while by now, she had become known as the Queen of Wall Street. However, there was another less flattering name given to Hetty. To many, she was given the name the Witch of Wall Street. This was the name acquired on the back of her notorious unwillingness to spend money despite her vast personal wealth and her personal hygiene or lack of it. For starters, she lived a borderline itinerant life. Though she had an office in the Chemical Bank on Broadway, close to Wall Street itself, she continued to have no fixed abode, drifting between hotels, boarding houses, and rented flats. The apparent reason for this was that she was unwilling to purchase a home in New York, as she would have to pay the city's property tax, but she also changed homes to avoid tax collectors. Well, her miserliness even went as far as not paying taxes. Furthermore, Hetty was so cheap that she reportedly never used hot water, nor did she turn on the heating during winter. Supposedly, she also didn't wash her hands, and because of this, her fingernails were always dirty and crusty. What's more, many claimed that she stunk, especially during the summer months. Her odor was said to be so unbearable that those working in the same office as her stayed as far away as possible. She even avoided going to the doctor, and elected to save money after 20 years of being troubled by a painful hernia. She then had no choice but to get surgery. Despite her immense wealth, she was outraged by the fee and tried to get out of paying. There are countless stories concerning her notorious stinginess, though some may simply be tales. She was believed to wear the same black dress every day and would do so until it was so worn out that it became completely tattered and turned green from filth, and only then would she buy another plain black dress. Another story claims that she once spent hours rummaging through a carriage she had been looking in for a stamp which had been lost. It was worth 2 cents. This stamp story may be untrue, but considering her reputation, one could never be too sure. Yet there is no doubt that Green did dress routinely in a black dress, perhaps in part owing to her religious upbringings as a Quaker, as well as her miserliness. Regarding this, Hetty stated, "Just because I dress plainly and do not spend a fortune on my gowns, they say I am cranky or insane." There were, though, indefinitely more negative aspects to Hetty Green's zealous guarding of her wealth. She disapproved of her daughter Sylvia's suitors, ensuring that Sylvia remained unmarried into her 30s. Hetty's disapproval was rooted in her suspicion that anyone dating her daughter must surely be after her wealth, which Sylvia would inherit a huge portion of one day. Eventually, one suitor, Matthew Astor Wilkes, met with her and qualified approval, principally because he was a minor member of the extremely wealthy Astor family and was possessed of some independent wealth himself. Nevertheless, before Sylvia and he married in 1909, Hetty insisted that he sign an agreement relinquishing any claim to money which Sylvia would inherit from her fortune. Yet, unquestionably, the most dreadful episode in Hetty Green's unwillingness to spend money and obsessive guarding of her wealth concerned her son Edward, or Ned, when he was a child and he broke his leg. Hetty was unwilling to pay for expensive medical care and tried to have him admitted to a free clinic. However, she was recognized by the administrators of the clinic, who refused her service on the basis that free clinics at the time were reserved for the poor and lower middle classes, whereas the Queen of Wall Street could easily afford to pay for the best medical care in New York City. Unperturbed at this rebuttal, Hetty determined to treat her son's injury herself. In the weeks that followed, the wound did not heal properly and eventually gangrene set in. Ned's leg had to be amputated, and he used a prosthesis made out of cork going forward. Despite this incident, he worked for his mother in later years, and after a long period spent managing her business affairs in Texas and Chicago, he returned to New York. She spent her final months living with him, finally having a fixed abode. She died on the 3rd of July 1916, aged 81. By that time, she was reputedly the richest woman in America. Indeed, her estate, which was split between Edward and Sylvia, probably ranged from somewhere between $100 million and $200 million. This was a sum equivalent to somewhere between $2.5 billion and $5 billion in today's money. And consequently, it can easily be said that Hetty Green was arguably the wealthiest woman in the world at that time. One wonders if she ever did find that 2-cent stamp. Unlike his mother, Edward was known to enjoy his wealth and liked to party. He didn't hold back on spending his inheritance. He built a mansion in Round Hill, Massachusetts, amassed a notable stamp and coin collection, and even made some generous contributions to society. With her mother's inheritance, Hetty's daughter Sylvia became one of the richest women in America, and when her brother Edward died in 1937, she inherited almost all of his estate as well. Sylvia Green Wilkes had no children and no real close relatives. She passed away in 1951, and left an estate worth about $90 million after taxes. At first, her will couldn't be located, but it was eventually found stuffed in a tin cabinet. Sylvia's closest genetic relative, a cousin, was mentioned in the will, and left $5,000, but she went to court and was after awarded $140,000. The remainder of her wealth was divided between charities, schools, and hospitals. Thus, in the end, a large part of the Witch of Wall Street's great fortune, which she was so unwilling to spend, was given away to complete strangers.
Did you miss me? Probably not after that great narration. Anyway, it's all forgotten lives from here on out. Now, let's go to 1950 New York to look into the life of the billionaire heiress whose family was stalked by tragedy and, according to some, cursed. Christina Onassis was born on the 11th of December 1950 at Leroy Sanitarium, later known as Leroy Hospital, in New York City. Her father was Aristotle Onassis and her mother was Tina Onassis Livanos. She was their second and last child, an older brother Alexander having been born 2.5 years before Christina arrived. In order to understand the trajectory of Christina Onassis' life, we need to have an understanding of who her parents were and the wealth they attained. Aristotle Onassis, her father, came from a somewhat humble background, but his father in turn was a successful self-made man. Aristotle was born in Smyrna on the east coast of Turkey in 1906. Onassis was of Greek descent, a not uncommon ethnicity amongst the population of Smyrna at the time. Later, when Greece went to war with Turkey following the First World War, Aristotle left Turkey for Argentina. There he began his ascent as a business magnate, moving into tobacco and freight transport, before making a lot of money during the Second World War. He then expanded into the burgeoning airline and casino industries after the war, while also becoming the world's largest shipping magnate. Ironically, Onassis' marriage to Christina's mother Tina was a union with a daughter of one of his greatest rivals. This was Stavros G. Livanos, the owner of the Livanos shipping empire, and one of the few companies that could challenge Onassis' dominance of the Mediterranean freight industry. Tina was just 17 when she married the 40-year-old Onassis in 1946. What this all meant was that Christina was born into an extremely wealthy business dynasty, one which continued to expand as she grew up, with her father cultivating new business ties in Saudi Arabia and its growing oil production ventures. Yet, there was controversy as well. Christina would have been well aware of her father's infamous tax affairs, which were dubious and involved his ships flying under Panamanian and Liberian flags to avoid paying tax and customs duties. Christina had an internationalist childhood. Her father had business dealings all over the world, and the family had homes and bases on 3 continents and many countries, such as Greece, Argentina, the US, France and England. As a consequence, they moved around a lot, and Christina did not have an education in just one country. She was also mainly looked after by servants, not getting much notice from her parents, who were busy with their business dealings, something typical of the children of extremely wealthy families. From the beginning of her teenage years, she was sent to England, where she attended Headington School, an elite independent girls' school, and then Queen's College in London in the late 1960s. These were tumultuous years for her family life. Her father had been over twice Christina's mother's age when they married, and the marriage was rocky through the 1950s, primarily owing to Aristotle's long-running affair with Maria Callas, a famous Greek-American singer. Eventually, her parents divorced in 1960. Further attention was brought to the family when Christina's father began a relationship in the mid-1960s with Jackie Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated president John F. Kennedy. They eventually married on the 19th of October 1968, with the union generating enormous press interest, given the Kennedy's celebrity in the 1960s. Neither Christina nor Alexander warmed to the stepmother, and they resented the increased security arrangements and media intervention in their lives. As a result of the relationship, and subsequent marriage. Christina always believed that Jackie was interested in her father for his money, and referred to her as, quote, "my father's unfortunate obsession." In the first weeks of 1973, when Christina was 22 years old, an event occurred which would shape the remainder of her life. Her brother Alexander had developed an interest in flying as a hobby in the late 1960s. He had flown thousands of hours and had a pilot's license. He was even president of one of the regional subsidiaries of the family airline business, Olympic Aviation. One catch was that Alexander's eyesight was not particularly good, though this may not have been directly responsible for the tragedy which occurred in January 1973. On the 22nd of January that late winter, Alexander took out his small amphibious plane, a Piaggio P136, to give a lesson to a prospective new pilot for the airline. Alexander sat in the right seat, while the new pilot Donald McCusker, who was flying the plane, was sat in the left-hand seat. A third pilot, Donald McGregor, sat in the back. Tragically, the flight resulted in a bad crash as they took off from Hellinikon International Airport in Athens, owing to some tangled cables. The right wing dipped soon after takeoff, and the plane crashed, with Alexander taking the brunt of the impact. He was badly hurt and was effectively on life support hours later. He died the following day after it was concluded that there was no possibility of saving him. He was just 24 years old. The new potential pilot McCusker and Alexander's regular pilot McGregor both suffered serious injuries, but survived. Alexander's death made Christina the heir to the family business and her father's enormous wealth. He took steps to now begin training her as his successor, though his mind was distracted at the same time. Aristotle became paranoid and convinced that his son's death had been owing to some foul play, blaming McCusker first and then concluding that the CIA had been behind the accident and were out to get him in retribution for his relationship with Jackie Kennedy. As he set about offering large rewards to anyone that could confirm his delusions, Christina headed to New York to begin acclimatizing to the role which she had believed all her life Alexander would eventually play in the business. The next 2 years saw concurrent tragedies. We have already seen that Christina's father took the death of Alexander very badly. So too did her mother. Tina had remarried twice since divorcing Aristotle. She had also developed an increasing problem with prescription medications, and this escalated following Alexander's death. On the 10th of October 1974, while staying in the Paris mansion she shared with her third husband, she suffered an overdose and died from a buildup of fluid in her lungs. Many people at the time and since have speculated that this was a suicide in despair following her son's death the previous year. Christina's final direct family member died just 6 months later. Her father had been suffering from myasthenia gravis, a muscular disorder, for several years. However, after Alexander's death, he stopped combating the condition, and the will to live seemed to have gone out of him. He died on the 15th of March 1975 in a Parisian hospital, supposedly from respiratory failure. With this, Christina had lost both her parents and her only sibling, all within the space of less than 26 months. These tragic circumstances prompted her to state, "I am all alone in the world now." With her father's death, a vast proportion of the Onassis family wealth and business was inherited by Christina. Approximately 45% of the estate was ruled by her father for the setting up of the Alexander Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, a charitable entity established in the memory of Alexander, but Christina inherited most of the other 55%, while she also successfully petitioned for the inheritance of some of the considerable fortune her mother had acquired as part of her parents' divorce back in 1960. With these, she was now a massively wealthy woman, with an estate of somewhere near $600 million, around $3 billion today, and in charge of a business empire. Christina almost immediately decided to reduce the burden of running the business by selling off substantial parts of it. By the mid-1970s, the Onassis business had expanded to freight shipping, transport, airlines, gambling, oil, and many other ventures besides. She sold some parts of it and donated other parts of the business and properties to charitable endeavours. Meanwhile, she consolidated her ownership of the core shipping and airline business, though there has been considerable speculation ever since as to how much of a role she actually played in the running of the day-to-day affairs of the business. The general impression is that the ins and outs were left to the board and directors of the company. During this time, Christina received extensive media attention for her personal life and lavish lifestyle. She lived in almost unheard of luxury, even spending tens of thousands of dollars to send a private jet to the US to bring her back Diet Cokes. She was also known to give thousands to busy friends to clear their schedules for her. The press also reported on her unhappy love life, as we will soon see, and her weight problems. Christina was known to frequently use crash diets, which would lead to her losing a lot of weight, but she would put it all back on when she hit a low point. Furthermore, Christina was widely believed to have a growing drug problem, with addictions to prescription drugs such as barbiturates, antidepressants, and tranquilizers. Christina's own marital life and relationships were even more chaotic than her father's. Between 1971 and 1987, she went through no less than 4 marriages and 4 divorces. The first of these was with Joseph Bolker. He was a real estate tycoon who was nearing his 50th year, while Christina was only 20 years of age when they married in 1971. It was a youthful fling of sorts for Christina, and one which strangely mirrored her own mother's marriage to Aristotle when she was just a teenager. They quickly realized they were not made for one another and divorced the following year. 3 years later, late in 1975, Christina married Alexandros Andreadis. He was a shipping magnate and heir to a wide-ranging business empire in Greece, which included banking interests. Again, the marriage was short-lived, and after just over a year, they divorced early in 1977. The union might be viewed as Christina trying to distract herself from the tragedy of losing all her family members in the 3 years that preceded it. Christina's third marriage came the following year, this time to Sergei Kozov. Like Andreadis, he was a shipping magnate, though studies since have concluded that Kozov, a Russian, also had close ties to the government of the USSR and may have been a KGB agent. There is a possibility that Kozov furthered the relationship with encouragement of Moscow to inveigle his way into an extremely important business empire in the Western world, at a time when the Cold War was heading back into a period of increased tensions between Russia and the United States. If so, the idea was soon put on ice. They divorced in 1980. After her marriage to Kozov was dissolved, Christina spent the longest period of her adult life unmarried. It was another 4 years before she married her fourth and final husband, Thierry Roussel. Roussel hailed from a prominent French family, which was involved in the pharmaceutical industry and French politics. Unusually amongst Christina's husbands, he was 3 years younger than her. This final marriage of Christina's resulted in her only child, a daughter named Athena after Christina's mother, born in 1985. 2 years later the marriage ended, unsurprisingly, when one considers that Roussel was a serial philanderer and had 2 other children with his mistress during his years married to Onassis. Christina would not marry again. As noted, Onassis had a growing addiction to prescription medication in the 1970s, and this worsened as the years went on, particularly from 1980 onwards, when she was diagnosed as suffering from clinical depression. With ready access to pliable doctors and prescriptions, Her intake increased in the 1980s as she began self-medicating away the scars of a fairly tortured life. On the 19th of November 1988, Christina was found dead in the bathtub. This was at a friend's house in Argentina, a country where she had spent a lot of her later years, having developed ties to the country that was her father's adopted homeland back in the 1920s. There she had sought to escape press scrutiny and was considering moving to permanently to raise Athena. Her death at just 37 years of age was deemed to have been from a heart attack, though there is absolutely no doubt that this was in part owing to her drug abuse, while others have speculated that there was some sinister element involved, given Onassis' huge wealth. Her body was returned to Greece, and she was buried in a family plot alongside her father and brother. Following her death, Onassis' $250 million estate became the subject of intense legal conflicts. Athena was her sole surviving heir, but was still only 3 years old at the time. Therefore, a number of Greek trustees had been appointed to oversee the estate on her behalf. Throughout the 1990s, legal disputes emerged between them and Thierry Roussel, a figure whose business dealings fluctuated enormously, and who often tried to tap his daughter's inheritance to aid in his financial difficulties. She eventually succeeded to the estate on her 18th birthday in early 2003. Christina's sole child is an equestrian show jumper today. Our last tale is probably the happiest on the list, but despite her generally good life, this heiress had a very sad upbringing, being neglected and used for her inheritance, and was the subject of an intense legal dispute when she was just 10 years old. Gloria Lauren Vanderbilt was born on the 20th of February 1924 in Manhattan, New York, into a dynasty of massive American wealth and influence. It's reported that after her birth, Gloria's father was heard saying, "It's fantastic how Vanderbilt she looks. See the corner of her eyes, how they turn up?" The Vanderbilts were a large network of families by then, all ultimately descended from Cornelius Vanderbilt, the foremost steamship and railway tycoon in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. Vanderbilt had once quite possibly been the wealthiest man alive, as his trains and ships formed the transport nucleus of the industrialization of America. The family's wealth had been dispersed in subsequent generations, though many signs of the Vanderbilt family were still enormously wealthy. Gloria's father was one of the heirs to this wealth. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was a great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. His older brother Alfred had inherited the majority of their branch of the family's money, but in an age when existing wealth could beget further wealth if invested wisely, Reginald's few $1 million of inheritance still constituted a sizable fortune. Though he ended up squandering a large part of it, spending lavishly on equestrian sports and gambling. He was also an alcoholic, and he died in September 1925 from cirrhosis of the liver when Gloria was just 1.5 years old. Gloria was the only child of Reginald's marriage to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. She came from a prominent political family and had married Reginald, who was 24 years older than her in 1923, not long before little Gloria was born. In his will, Reginald left most of his wealth to Gloria Jr. and another daughter he had, Kathleen, from a separate marriage. Reginald left Gloria's mother only a comparatively small allowance, and this would soon become the point of contention in an infamous trial, which Gloria would be central to while she was still just a child. Despite Reginald Vanderbilt's irresponsibility and poor business acumen, the estate which Gloria and her half-sister inherited was still worth about $5 million, a very sizable sum in the 1920s, worth approximately $100 million in today's money. This was held in trust for Gloria, and the money was to be administered during her younger years by her mother. However, in the course of the late 1920s and early 1930s, and particularly so after the Wall Street crash and the inception of the Great Depression, Gloria's aunt, her father's sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, began to scrutinize how Gloria's mother was spending this money. This escalated in the early 1930s as Gertrude began questioning whether Gloria's mother was fit on any level to parent her. There was a legitimate case here. Gloria Sr. had spent much of the second half of the 1920s living the high life in Paris, London and Biarritz, and had often left her daughter with family members for protracted periods of time in New York while she swanned around Europe. It was in this context that Gertrude Vanderbilt pressed legal charges against Gloria's mother in 1934 to obtain custody of Gloria. What was dubbed the trial of the century at the time was really just a custody battle, though it also focused on whether or not Gloria's mother had mismanaged her daughter's inheritance. The trial was scandalous. Newspapers reported on the salacious revelations for weeks as evidence of a lesbian relationship Gloria's mother had been involved in surfaced. On one occasion, a maid who had worked for Gloria's mother testified for 5 hours in a manner which depicted Gloria Sr. as what one publication at the time termed, quote, a cocktail-crazed dancing mother, a devotee of sex erotica, and the mistress of a German prince. Unsurprisingly, Gloria herself ended up being described as a poor little rich girl by the media, the 10-year-old heiress who had lost her father and been effectively abandoned by her neglectful mother. Meanwhile, in an effort to manage the media circus in and around the court, the judge ordered that the court be emptied of nearly all attendees in order for 10-year-old Gloria to testify. When the result came down, it was a negative one for Gloria's mother. She was deemed to have been a neglectful mother, and custody of her was granted to Gertrude, as was the responsibility of managing her inheritance, although an allowance was maintained for Gloria Sr. Her mother was allowed visits on weekends and would appeal the result in 1936, but she was unsuccessful in doing so, and the relationship between mother and daughter never fully healed. In 1946, when she was in her early 20s and had acquired full control over her finances, Gloria stopped paying the $21,000 allowance which her mother received annually, saying her mother could work for a living and that she would henceforth be donating the $21,000 to various charities every year. From the 1940s until her death, Gloria's mother would live with her sister, Thelma Furness, Viscountess Furness, in New York City and Los Angeles. Gloria Sr. eventually died from cancer in 1965. As Gloria grew up after the trial, she attended numerous schools in New York and the wider East Coast of the United States. Initially, this was at the prestigious Greenvale School on Long Island, followed by a stint at Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, a girls' preparatory school, which has been attended over the years by the daughters of America's leading business and political dynasties. An increasingly attractive young woman, she was also modeling by her late teens, though her full foray into the world of fashion would only come decades later. By age 17, tiring of the rigidity of life under her aunt, she struck out on her own and went to live in Hollywood in California. These late teenage years saw her endeavor to begin a career in the arts, attending the Art Student League in New York City for a time, and then working both as a visual artist and as an actress, the latter in part motivating her decision to move out west to Los Angeles in the early 1940s. This interest would continue over the years, and in the 1950s and 1960s, she appeared in numerous Broadway productions, as well as several well-known television shows of the time, such as The Love Boat and The Time of Your Life. Gloria's arrival in Hollywood soon resulted in her first marriage. This was to Pat DeCicco, a Hollywood talent agent who was in his early 30s. She was just 17 when they married. The marriage was abusive, and Gloria later stated that DeCicco had left her repeatedly with black eyes and psychologically belittled her. She divorced him in 1945. However, the union had done lasting damage to her relationship with her aunt Gertrude. She disapproved of him from the start, and as Gloria married him anyway, Gertrude cut her out of her share of the Vanderbilt wealth in her will. She died in 1942, just a year after the marriage. A day after divorcing Chico, Gloria married the 63-year-old conductor, Leopold Stokowski. It was a happier union than her first, despite him being 3 times her age at the time of their marriage. It lasted 10 years and resulted in 2 children, sons called Leopold Stanislas and Christopher, born in 1950 and 1952. Again, Gloria did not remain single for long after her second divorce in 1955. Just a year later, she married Sidney Lumet. He was the same age as Gloria, and they had quite similar interests, as he was a Broadway director and she was an aspiring actress. The following year, his immensely successful career as a director commenced, with the release of 12 Angry Men, one of the greatest films of all time. The marriage did not result in any children, and ended in 1963, presumably the result of infidelities, as both of them were married again within a matter of weeks. Gloria's 4th and final husband was Wyatt Emery Cooper, another screenwriter and actor. They would remain married until his death during open-heart surgery in 1978. They had 2 children together, Carter and Anderson, born in 1965 and 1967 respectively. While these are the details of her 4 marriages, Gloria had numerous other relationships with prominent individuals over the years, many of them affairs, while she was otherwise married. These include the relationships with the actor Marlon Brando, the singer and actor Frank Sinatra, the inventor and mogul Howard Hughes, and a reputed affair with the children's writer Roald Dahl. While she had set out to be an actress in the 1940s and 1950s, Gloria is primarily remembered today for her fashion career. In the 1970s, she collaborated with Mohan Morangi of the Morangi Group to launch a line of jeans bearing her name. The line was successful, and in the years that followed was expanded out into a range of other clothing and accessories, including dresses, blouses, shoes, leather bags, and other items. This continued to expand over the years, and by the 2000s also involved a range of successful fragrances. All of these endeavours were lucrative, catching the changing trends of women's fashion, and so Gloria managed to establish herself as a successful businesswoman between the 1970s and the 2000s. Gloria Vanderbilt's later life was more settled and less chaotic in many ways than her earlier life had been. She certainly had a less dramatic love life, and she did not marry again after her 4th husband died in 1978. She developed new interests in the 1980s and 1990s. One was renewed interest in a career as a visual artist. Back in the late 1960s, some of her earlier work had been used to develop a range of cards by Hallmark, and in the 1990s, she began working again in glass paint and pottery. The result was a series of shows, most of which were held in the 2000s, in various exhibition spaces on the East Coast, while she also took up a role as a philanthropist in this respect, acting as a critic at various shows and competitions. However, Gloria's great love in her later life was writing. Between the 1970s and her death, she published half a dozen memoirs, documenting various aspects of her life up to that time, notably reflecting on the trial involving her mother and aunt back in 1934, and another on her marriages and relationships over the years. She also published 3 fiction novels: Never Say Goodbye, published in 1989, The Memory Book of Star Faithful, published in 1994, and Obsession, an erotic tale, published in 2009. There was also a growing interest in writing about her, notably through the appearance of Barbara Goldsmith's book, Little Gloria, in 1980, a work examining the trial in 1934 and the cultural context in which it occurred. Gloria Vanderbilt died at home in Manhattan on the 17th of June 2019. The apparent cause of her death was stomach cancer, though she was 95 years of age by then and had lived a long and productive life. She was laid to rest in the Vanderbilt family crypt on Staten Island. One of her sons from her fourth marriage to Walter Emery Cooper, Carter, had committed suicide back in 1988. She left her estate to the other son from that union, Anderson Cooper, the well-known CNN news anchor and journalist. Thank you everyone for watching this video on more tragic millionaires you wouldn't want to be. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you want more videos like this, be sure to also let me know down below in the comments. I also had another video just like this around 4 months ago, so if you found this interesting, be sure to check that out. And anyway, if you have any suggestions, also leave them in the comments, and I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.